we'll just wait another minute or so for everyone to take their seats. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the FX Industry Conference sponsored by Shift4X. And before we begin our next panel, I just want to really thank the Shift4X team for putting together something quite special. There are a lot of conferences in FX, but you have managed to put together a very meaningful mix of people here in New York, comprised both of retail and institutional market participants. So we thank you, Ian, Matt, and Justin for your efforts and your entire team. So our panel today will be exploring FX technology, specifically data centers, connectivity, latency, ecosystems, and the question, is FX actually re-centralizing? By some counts, there are over 100 independent aggregation projects happening around the globe. And nearly every month, there's a new ECN being launched or a new platform being announced. Market makers and traders have actually physically congregated in data centers in specific locations around the world to cut down on geographical latency. And so with prime brokers really facilitating trades by acting as central counterparties, providing credit, clearing, and settlement, taking those variables out of the equation, the question is the marketplace really fragmented, or is it actually centralizing? The promise has always been of OTC markets to provide deep, direct-to-direct, counterparty-to-counterparty relationships that facilitate trading and a friction-free market. So those are the questions that we'll be exploring today. My name is Darren Jur. I'm the COO of Market Factory. Market Factory is a software-as-a-service company focused in foreign exchange, specifically the institutional market. And we provide a software technology that lets customers write to one single API, allowing them to access over 50 different ECNs, banks, and other liquidity providers. And so, as your moderator, I'd like to ask each of you in helping me welcome this panel of distinguished speakers. And if the panelists could actually just introduce themselves and tell us who you are, what your company does, and maybe give us an idea of the types of customers you work with, either institutional, retail, and so forth. Simon, maybe kick us off.
Okay. I'm Simon Wilson-Taylor. I'm the CEO and co-founder of one of the many new ECNs called Molten Markets. A background in foreign exchange that goes back way too long, back to 1975, but a long experience having built and run the world's first multi-dealer platform, FXConnect, and then bought and co-run the second platform, Coronex, and so taking that experience into building and launching our own ECN.
My name is Andrew Rowich. I am the co-founder and CEO of 10 Financial Systems. We primarily provide interconnectivity solutions in the retail space, working with about 54 brokers and 36 different liquidity venues, ECNs, primarily focused on providing institutional quality execution and scalability to the MetaTrader platform, but just recently scaling out to a few other retail venues and direct connectivity.
My name is Musharraf Tavmassian. I'm the Chief Development Officer of Alpari. We're one of the large brokers in the space. Our product line covers from retail, B2B, and institutional. And I think we have quite good coverage globally with having a number of regulated companies in different jurisdictions and having using both our own proprietary technology along with a number of the well-known ECNs and bridges and so on.
Enrique Havlicek, business dev for Equinix, the global neutral data center. 25 years in IT environment, the past 12 years working for financial firms in US.
Jubin Pejman from FCM 360. We're a managed services provider in the financial vertical space. We specialize in connecting hedge funds and prop shops to different types of brokers and bank liquidity. We manage all their gear in a handful of desirable locations around the world so they can all talk to each other.
Great. So let's talk about trends. Some have said that the FX markets are repeating the developments seen in equities over the last 10 years. We've seen this movie before, and we kind of know how it ends. What lessons can we learn from other financial markets in terms of innovations around latency, dark pool liquidity, other market structure elements? Simon, could you begin?
Oh boy. Yeah, so as a long-standing FX guy, my visceral reaction to that question is always that the foreign exchange market is much more sophisticated than anything the equity markets have thought of yet, and how dare people make the comparison. Fortunately, in my career, I also ran an equity ATS called Lattice that was a very innovative product in its time, and in fact, much ahead of its time, and sat on the board of a broker-dealer, so I have a slightly more balanced view. In many ways, foreign exchange is more sophisticated. The OTC nature of the market, I think, allows it, and the sort of self-regulated nature of the market allows it to have always been very innovative, very forward-moving, and unconstrained by the regulatory brakes that can be put on the process. Having said that, the technology situation in the foreign exchange market has been an evolutionary one and has been significantly behind what we've seen in the equities markets. So the evolutionary process in foreign exchange has largely been led by customers. It's been led by the advent of ECNs and advent of high-frequency traders who've kind of taught the banks and other market makers how they should be making markets, and they're continuing to learn, sometimes the hard way. But the structure of the market, while technically isn't exactly the same as the equity market, in many ways is. And you've got very large warehousing liquidity providers, both banks and now non-banks, who are effectively looking like exchanges. And then the connectivity to those exchanges needs to be established, and the algos that people trade on need to be established. And all of that is happening, and there's still, I think, many things that we can learn from the equities markets. There is one major difference, though, and that is that the people who are providing the exchanges, the banks and non-banks, are principals to the trade rather than just a utility. And therefore, they have a very different response to some of these innovations because they're hurt by them, unlike an exchange which simply allows or doesn't allow certain technologies to take place. So there are differences that we need to remain aware of, whilst parallels that we need to exploit.
Interesting themes emerging. Self-regulation versus self-regulation, do it yourself rather than do it for me, right? Led by customers, and also the lack of a centralized utility playing a neutral role where counterparties actually in a true OTC market are taking on risk and have a view. Henrique, you've seen lots of different asset classes co-located in your facilities. What's your view on this?
From Equinix point of view, I would switch a little bit the idea. Historically, the first FX platform that landed in Equinix was in 2006. Was a small pub or access node. In 2007, we had the second access node. 2008, the first access node became a matching engine. So only in 2008, we opened for the first equities access node. 2009 was the first equities matching engine. So between 2006 and 2009, we were building up an ecosystem, or FX was building up an ecosystem that equities took advantage. When equities world landed in Equinix, the ecosystem was already there, built by the foreign exchange. But in terms of technology, when you compare FX and equities, so equities is multicast, FX unicast. FX is a couple of 20 pairs. Equities, thousands of messages. FX burst. Equities, high high bandwidth utilization. So I can, go on in this technology. What I want to say is whatever asset class you're trading, whatever flavor you're trading, Equinix provide the infrastructure to make your business working faster and reliable.
It's an interesting point. I think you touch on also the whole the role that customers have in driving the technologies being employed in this market. Specifically, algorithmic trading. People have it at the back of their minds. Andrew, maybe you can comment on what you see new technologies are being driven by this market segment.
Sure. I think the FX industry, as like was said, much more of a routed industry than a matched industry right now. It's much more tunneling and finding the way that the trade needs to get to, rather than getting it to a centralized point and matching buyers and sellers. You have that OTC concept. So from a networking perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, it makes for a lot more creative solutions in terms of how parties interact with each other, how they can bypass different aspects of the system, unlike in an equities situation or a direct exchange situation where everybody's trying to get to the same point. So people like Equinix and providers like 360T are here because that ecosystem is much different. You don't have the nebulous that you have within a more traditional exchange area, and that's why not only hardware but software technologies come out every day that bypass different abilities, different bottlenecks within the system, reduce latency, because the highway as it exists is not as direct, it's not as clear as what you're going to see in a more traditional market.
Mush, anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, it seems that the FX space is a lot more creative than the other asset classes, and I think even brokers' strategy, future strategy is driven by the creativity provided by tech firms and even clients. And like Andrew said, different ways of routing and different platforms that become mainstream and demanded by the global client base. So brokers need to adapt, and therefore the infrastructure that needs to be there to support the broker and this new technology needs to adapt with it. And I think last comes the regulation to try to figure out what's going on.
Any questions from the audience so far? Like, one of my goals is to make sure that no heads nod during the session. So I encourage you to ask questions. Does someone have the microphone from the organizing? Okay, well, you can speak loudly. And whoever asks a question gets a free Market Factory pen. Just come see me afterwards, okay? All right, so there continues to be a lot of discussion about the benefits of transitioning various components of the FX business into the cloud. Specifically, hosting, aggregation, trading, reporting, CRM, and many other elements can actually be hosted in a third-party system in the cloud on a network. But how the cloud works, when to use it, and other key considerations remain hazy. So how can executives intelligently select which cloud-based services to use and weigh the costs and benefits of doing so and ensure they are not losing security, anonymity, or quality of service when transitioning to the cloud? Any comments from the panel?
I think the important first thing to do is to define exactly what the cloud is. It's one of those terms like Web 2.0 or social trading that everybody here has heard and is probably, if you're higher up in a company, said to some of your underlings, when are we getting into the cloud? I'm not exactly sure what that is, but let's get in it. Cloud is as software as a service, as taking something that you traditionally run internal to a broker on your desktop and putting it in a hosted format where you leverage shared infrastructure. The FX industry has actually been an innovator in that regards. CurrentX, the ECNs that are hosted and accessed through the internet have been around for over a decade and centralized in data centers because of the nature of the business, because latency is such a sensitive thing within this industry. We've all been in the cloud for a while, and you're definitely seeing a trend towards, okay, well now I want to get my clients in the cloud. I want to see VPS providers come in. I want to see co-located hosting for my trading platforms. Putting your CRM in the cloud doesn't necessarily solve as many issues, but as an industry as a whole, I think we need to be looking in how can we make our cloud safer? How can we take aspects of things like what we more traditionally see as the cloud, Amazon cloud, redundant services that can travel around the world depending on if your website needs to be up or down in different jurisdictions. And if you listen during the industry trends panel, and the gentleman from Hotspot and Kernex both talking about how we all were very aware of the diesel fuel situation going on in Equinix at the time of Hurricane Sandy. And everybody in this room would be affected by that. And though we're all in the cloud, we're all kind of in the same cloud right now, and that doesn't really afford for the greatest disaster recovery, redundancy, flexibility worldwide in terms of how traders interact with this system that we're all sharing resources in.
Yeah, let me talk about cloud as well, but just because you mentioned Sandy, we were not affected by Sandy. We were not affected by 2003 event that happened in here, the blackout. We're not affected by Tokyo earthquake. We were not affected. We have 8 or 9 nines, 99.99 uptime. But just talking about cloud, I have a, you were saying that how we define cloud. I kind of have a definition of cloud. Who is a dinosaurs like me that used to have, would save your data inside of something like that, From 8-inch, we moved to 5.5, 3/4, all right? CD, DVD, I didn't finish. Hold on.
Disk is older than me.
No, USB. And it's getting smaller. You notice that the storage is getting smaller, and all of a sudden the storage disappear. Not disappear, it's virtual. Storage is cloud, and where is cloud? Cloud is inside of Equinix data centers. So we've been seeing that more and more specialized cloud computing companies, storage cloud, especially for quantitative brokers, the ones, different flavors. Equities, for example, they generate 50 gigabytes per day in US. It's 13, 14 terabytes a year. So where are you going to save? So this is something that we should think about as well, about clouds.
I'll give this a shot. I've been around long enough to see people that could never afford to do hosting, never afford to go to places like, Savvis, Global Switch, Telehouse. There was Exodus Communications, where apparently if you put your gear in Exodus, you would get $5 billion of funding if you're old enough to remember that. And what would wind up happening is that you had a $10,000 to $20,000 a month entry point to these facilities. I mean, the first cage that FCM 360 ever rented, I think, it was probably about, in the late 90s, would have cost us about $10,000 to $20,000, and we got it for substantially less than that, right? So that's like a history of it. Now, what is a cloud? I think the cloud has, for the financial purposes, has nothing to do with Amazon, because Amazon, in my opinion, is not a financial cloud. These are the things that I think that the cloud needs to have. You need to be able to tell your clients where the cloud is. You have to let them know what services are in the cloud. You have to let them know who can you connect to in the cloud, and basically, where can the cloud connect you to outside. So from the terms of, foreign exchange, the low latency financial cloud becomes interesting. So if you go to Amazon as a liquidity aggregator, you're going to call up Amazon and say, how do I get hooked into JP Morgan? They're going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? You're going to go to Rackspace, and they're apparently fanatical cloud support guys. You're going to say, so I need to get the hotspot. Who? Who is that? So and then this is where places like Equinix come in. And really, Equinix is unparalleled in some of its ecosystems around the world. And quite frankly, if you can't describe on a diagram or a piece of paper what a client's getting with these facets, you're not going to be able to run your foreign exchange business properly, period. If you want to build the world's best aggregation system, the world's best liquidity provider platform, the best execution that you want to do a triangle arb between, a news feed and some, euro-dollar spread from Chicago or whatever, you go to basically a handful of buildings around the world, and you know what the latencies are between Chicago and New York, Chicago and Slough, Chicago and Docklands. I know, there's an FR2 location, for Deutsche Börse if you're doing an arb between, FR2 and, these are the things that you need to know. So when we define cloud, we say this is the cloud, these are the components, this is exactly what you get. You sign a contract, it magically appears. You don't have to worry about it. That's what a cloud provider should do. Not say we magically have a cloud and you can hook into it. Because what does it hook into, right? So if you can't answer all those questions, you're not helping people in the banking industry.
I've got a slightly different view on it. I was slightly surprised by the question. I thought it was a question that we might have been asking 5 years ago rather than today. But if I just go back to my experience, 5 years before CurrentX existed, we were trying to put stuff in the cloud. So the FX Connect platform, we were running data centers in 3 global locations. There was no public internet that we could rely on for trading. There was no private network. There was no Savis. There was no Radiance. None of these people existed. So we were trying to deliver globally deployed kind of cloud-type solutions, and we succeeded in 1996. Then this question was very relevant. Where's my services? Where's my data? Where's everything going on? And then I roll forward to what I was doing before I set up Molten Markets, where I was global head of e-commerce for a small institution called UBS. And asking the questions like, where are our servers? And the IT guys would look at me and say, why does it matter? And so then my next question was, well, are they on our premises or somebody else's premises? And again, why does it matter? And all of our stuff essentially was in the cloud somewhere. And it no longer is a relevant question. And it no longer is relevant, I think, whether it's your own data, your own server sitting in some remote data center, or whether your software and services are running on somebody else's server. We all know how to manage the security around this. We do it well. I think the question's passed now.
It's great points. If we look back on the history of FX, as you've mentioned, what I'm hearing is that EBS was its own private cloud. Reuters was its own private cloud. CurrentX was its own private cloud. Every bank network with their order books traveling around the sun between the different trading centers, you connect to a bank, you connect into their market data in cloud. So really, all these fragmented markets have to be brought together, right? Fragmentation, the opposite side of that coin is really aggregation. Talk to us about aggregation. How do we build a cloud to aggregate all these places with one connection? Should we build or should we buy? That is the question. Builders, buyers?
Let me just, if I can tail end that, until about 2007, you were right across the board, and you're right almost across the board even today. But when my clients come to me and tell me they want to be an NY4, I can't say, why do you need to be there? They're going to say, because every bank that I deal with wants me to cross-connect there. It's like, otherwise, okay, you can be in Hackensack, you can be in Karlstad, and be like, well, how much does the comms cost? Like, oh, that'll cost you an extra $30,000 a month. To be like, yeah, I'd rather cross-connect. So that's the business that I'm in. But again, very valid. But
what I'm saying is we do it well. Obviously, you do it well. So.
Yeah. So for the corporate level, but for the front line, when someone says, why is there 3 millisecond slippage on this execution? It's like, well, we need to figure that out. Why did this take 150 microseconds? It should have taken 70. That's where the NY4s and the LD4s come in. Yeah. So.
Well, maybe we'll go off your note and come back to aggregation. Tell us about network providers and co-locating or cross-connecting directly with liquidity providers. What are the differences between the various models, technologies, and how does it affect whom you trade with? Maybe we'll have Henrique opine on this.
First of all, it's so good to be in a panel with a couple of customers that they are talking about Equinix. It is fantastic. Equinix is not a liquidity provider, it's a liquidity facilitator. We have across the river in Secaucus, we have 14 FX platforms, 7 in London and 4 in Japan, Tokyo. Those customers with us, they open access nodes. They have access nodes in Australia, they have access node in Hong Kong. So yes, the market is fragmented, but when you see that FX is unique, works 24 hours a day globally, and Equinix is unique and works 24 hours a day globally, that's, Equinix provides that interconnectivity. Inside of our data center, we have 700 plus carriers. So if you are not in the ecosystem that you have agility or a facility to interconnect around the world, you are definitely off.
Okay, we're all owned by Equinix. But with that said, how about some alternatives? Can we use a different data center? Do we have other options, or should we just basically buy you drinks, Henrique, and hope for better pricing? No, I'm kidding. Okay, so Andrew, tell us about alternatives. There's got to be something else other than Equinix.
Well, geez, put me on the spot here. Enrique's going to jump over and slap me across the face. I'm also a customer too. Just like, when I first got into the FX industry and would attend conferences and sometimes driven towards brokers and the institutional space and sometimes driven towards traders, and I would leave these things and ask myself, how many times can people talk about how short your fiber optic cable can get between you and the liquidity providers in order to facilitate microsecond level trading and a lot of the guys doing arbitrage and things like that? It was a necessary evil in the Chicago kind of FX space. And what we're now seeing, even in retail and institutional side, and I'm going to lean into your aggregation question a little bit, is that in the trends panel, they talked about quality of execution and quality of spreads. We have 100 aggregators out there. Some are better than others, but they're all doing a very similar thing. Bringing in a lot of feeds and not arbing the banks, not trying to take advantage of it, but trying to tighten their spreads and execute as best possible on those spreads and holding the banks accountable for last look or no last look or quality of slippage. And that all at the end of the day, it's all traveling through wires. It's all coming into an ecosystem where it may not be that Enrique gets to decide that Equinix is for everybody, but the LPs that are providing quality execution decide where to put their systems. And unfortunately, the trend hasn't changed. How short is your fiber optic cable to those systems? How efficient is your aggregation system that's bringing those prices together? And if it's low latency arbitrage, or if it's retail clients trying to trade euro dollar on 0.1 and 0.2 spreads, which are pretty unprecedented for that side of the industry, it all comes down to quality of execution, which in an ecosystem where everything's disparate and you can get to anybody any which way, it comes down to quality of co-location.
I used to say that the short distance between 2 points is not a straight line, it's an Equinix cross connection.
All right. Maybe I can give this a different tint, okay?
Please.
So we deal with a lot of aggregators. We deal with a lot of software companies, a lot of ISVs, prop shops, brokers. I've seen the equities market, I've seen the futures market evolve to basically one or two major exchanges, and everyone's fighting, and everyone has, everyone's in Aurora or MAWA or NASDAQ, 1400 Federal. But the difference between the executions in the FX space is the quality is as good as the relationship that the LP or your whatever you want to say, the introduction of your capital to a liquidity provider or a bank is. And if you don't have that right feed, or if you don't have that right relationship, it doesn't matter if you're 1 nanosecond away from hotspot or CurrentX. It doesn't matter, because the prime broker or the bank who is providing that liquidity to you, or the ID that you trade on, it can make a difference between you getting a great feed or the right person looking at it. So that's one thing. So that's something that no one really wants to talk about. So we've talked ourselves out of a lot of business. There was actually a broker that swore they wanted to be an NY4, and we talked them out of it, actually. I'm sorry. But I said, I cannot lie to you. The ECN is not an NY4, and your clients will probably not benefit from it. And they said, wow, I've never heard anyone say that to me. So you should work on your relationships to get your executions better. You cannot pay us. We're not going to mark up a cabinet in Equinix and rent you some servers, and then you're going to come back to me in 6 months and say, how come you didn't tell me this? Right?
Tell me the ECN in names that I'm going to knock that door.
No, that's right. No, but you know what? The point is that this is a business that's actually built more upon relationships than any other exchange-traded business in the world, period. I mean, if you go to New York Stock Exchange now, Barclays owns the floor. At least they did until a year ago. They almost bought every single company that existed, and there were a bunch of guys hanging around twiddling their thumbs. My computer trades for me. I want to go trade OTC derivatives. It sounds more exciting, right? The point is that those are relationships that have been hundreds of years in the making. All the other major exchanges down in there were brokerage shops 150 years ago, 140 years ago in Florida that people used to go. They're called bucket shops by today's standards, but they all basically migrated to really the dominant two players in the globe, which was really NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange by market share. Right? But this is a market that you need to know people in Hong Kong. You need to know people in Nomura, Goldman Sachs. You need to know people at FC Stone. You need to know Andrew's company to give you a bridge if you want to start off. You have to know, the guy at Equinix to tell you that, these are the entities that are there. Then you make a decision. But it all comes down to the relationships. So again, it would be great if everyone in the world had a cross-connect, but it's not a panacea.
Absolutely. Relationships and liquidity, highly correlated. I think we've succeeded.
Can I throw one other point in here
Sure,
that hasn't been made, because I think it's important?
Okay.
This conference and most of the discussion we're talking about is focused on what I'd call highly active foreign exchange, where if you're a player in that business, you have to be an Equinix MY4 and you have to have your servers there, and we're customers as well, so thank you.
Thank you.
But there's a whole other segment of this market, especially the request for quote kind of marketplace, which is still electronic, but isn't as low latency, doesn't have the same requirements. And almost none of that is in Equinix. Most of it is hosted in data centers elsewhere, and we have a product in that space, and that piece of it is not in Equinix, it's elsewhere. So there are alternatives.
I think also, I think we've covered the sophisticated side of the market, but I want to shine some light on kind of the unsophisticated side, because it's really a matter of scale and, relationships. Yeah, they're integral, but also, how much capital you have, how much technical workforce you have. And in today's age where you can, buy a trading platform and liquidity, just like buying a CD in a software store, is unfortunately many startup brokers, and, I haven't seen small and big and, everything in between. You just buy the platform, and, really brokers start from the marketing edge because you found a niche, you've found a, new type of product, but you have no experience of, this side of the world of sophistication. So what you do, unfortunately, yeah, you can even go to Amazon and, pay $40, and within a day you're up and running with your platform, and, with a nice website, to the client, you're as good as, Alpari or FXIC. So I think it's the matter of scale and who you know, and unfortunately, you kind of learn through your mistakes. You do that, and you realize that, your quotes are 5 seconds delayed. And then slowly you get into the millisecond world and all this sophistication.
Let me back up the last two comments, actually. The majority of the flow that goes over our servers is actually commercial hedging and large banks that pick up the phone and place an order on a web GUI. We just happen to host the thing that serves the web GUI. But it is true. It's a commercial hedger, non-speculative, non-high frequency trade that makes up the overwhelming majority of every market. Even in the futures market, about 85% of it is commercial hedgers, not high frequency prop shops.
We have a question from the audience.
Hi there. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, so just for the two gentlemen on the ends, I'm a network engineer. I can follow the stopping point with the IP peering. And I have an encryption box on my end, and the bank has one on the other. Where do you see encryption in the cloud being explainable to a regulator?
Well, the bottom line is that someone else, no? Okay, the bottom line is that there are two ways to do this. The cloud is a scary term, and if you can't clearly define it, it becomes a nightmare. So in other words, we have some very large, banks that have approached us, and now they're clients of ours, and they say, so we did some testing on the cloud, and again, it's a corporate mandate. It's like, get in the cloud, right? And then they said, well, there are different types of clouds. I said, let me explain something to you. If you want to do this, you have to be able to control every aspect of the cloud. And again, it's like spits in the face of the cloud. But the point is, cloud becomes vaporware. So we can say, okay, you're in the cloud. What does that mean? That means that we can basically provide all the services to you without bothering you with those details. You're going to have private lines that are dedicated fiber between, let's say, TY3, Equinix, and let's say LO4 Docklands, right? And then the majority of the banks that you talk to, they have some sort of BGP mesh network of, like, let's say, a primary and a failover going between, let's say, like New York and London. The majority of business that's done, they can call it cloud all they want, but it still has the same major tenants. It's like you can have like Amazon is a great example. They still put their stuff in a brick and mortar business called a building. Okay, they still know where their lines are going. They don't just magically lease out and subcontract to different people. Their engineers have diagrams, they have Visio charts, they know exactly what the IP address is, they know what their networks are, they know who they're BGP peering, they have errand numbers, and all these things still have to exist. So at the end of the day, the things that you do, then it gets to like, okay, I know I have an endpoint here, my lights are up on my switch, layer 3 is talking. Now let's see what's going on with our latency, do we have microbursts, and then you can just say we have a standard foundation. But again, the cloud has to be definable for that type of application. Otherwise, if you just do it on your desktop and it magically goes on a Comcast cable line, then it could be sniffed, right? But And there are further ways that you can, depending on which carrier you deal with, you can make sure that there are fiber owners only that you deal with. We deal only with tier 1 carriers on the internet, and we deal with primarily companies that own fiber and can tell us on a map where that thing goes, where it makes a right turn. We recently did a light up in 165 Broadway. I spoke to the guy who was in the sewer that was splicing us, okay? I know where my stuff goes. Do you know where your stuff goes? Sort of like that, yeah.
Since this is a technology panel, one of the questions that often arises, I mean, the panel's bringing up great things in terms of technology, but it's a mind-boggling list, right? We have to worry about networks, networking equipment, hosting, software, counterparties, cross-connects. What should we actually insource and what should we actually outsource? Maybe we could have Simon and Andrew and others who've been doing such decisions recently give us an idea.
This is the aggregation question?
Aggregation, technology. Should we buy aggregators?
Yeah. So obviously a lot depends on who you are. So if you are a prop shop trying to look at the market, you're probably going to be much more inclined to build your aggregation because there'll be some secret sauce that you want to have in there. And you may feel that if you buy or license somebody else's aggregator, there's going to be some fat in that technology that is going to create unnecessary latency, so maybe you can get some advantage. So probably if you're a prop shop, you're going to build your own. On the other hand, if you're a bank, regional bank or whatever, and you want to begin to use an aggregator to look at the market, why on earth would you build your own? There's plenty of, it's a commoditized offering out there. There's some great providers, and you can take something off the shelf with almost no capital outlay, and you can pay a fee or not for that aggregation service, and you can get a great product. I've been through that decision process ourselves for what we're trying to do with our business, and we've done a hybrid. We kind of took some commoditized components from one of the leading players in the space, and we built some new stuff on top of it. So again, there's any number of different ways of skinning this cat, but it obviously depends very much on your perspective and who you are.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think when we see a new ECN venue or aggregation venue come out, and a lot of times we're either doing similar things to it at 1.0, or more likely than not, somebody will want to hook it into their MetaTrader at some point. It tends to be the trend. So we try to look at these new systems and say, well, what is this bringing to the table? What's different? Are they competing on cost? Are they adding new functionality? How much quicker can this process get? And not to simplify what an aggregator does, but how fast can you sort quotes in a list and spit out the best one to your clients? So you have to take a look at these 100 or so different technologies out there and say, what are the differentiators between them? What problems are they addressing? And then humbly speaking, as a broker, you need to say, am I going to do it better than the top 2 or 3 of these 100 that I should probably be choosing from? Retail brokers have very specific challenges these days, and not a lot of the legacy aggregation and ECN solutions will take in CFDs. And so now all of a sudden, every one of your clients wants to trade CFDs in addition to FX. You have to cross-margin them, but you're managing 2 different prime or credit relationships in order to do that. So looking at technologies, figuring out what they do to differentiate from each other, and really thinking, what do I benefit from trying to build this myself and take the risk of doing it internally?
Great. Last question. How does regulation impact technology adoption in our market? And what are the ramifications? Mush, can you address?
Yeah, and I think this covers a bit of the previous question. I mean, time to market is I guess the first requirement from brokers' part, because you want to take advantage of a trend, of an opportunity, a new product, new market, so on. And then comes, cost, resources, and risks. One of the risks is being regulatory. So, if you've chosen to outsource either your technology or the cloud part or, the aggregation, whatever, you really depend on them. And if that rainy day comes, you're going to get the grief from the customers. You're going to have the legal liability for, the risk, the trades, the regulator coming and penalizing you, shutting you down, whatever. And it's really out of your hands. What you can do is, pray and keep calling the people on the other end that you're outsourcing to. And I think Japan is a great example where it's one of the strictest regulators I've dealt with, and they don't joke around. 3-4 mistakes in technology, and they either shut you down or they penalize you. And in Japan specifically, it's a very big key, regulatory risk. Can you really trust this technology, and is it redundant enough where you can, sleep at night?
I'm personally a fan of prayer in those situations. But Simon, any final thoughts as we conclude?
The regulation question is an interesting one. If we go back a long way in history, I forget exactly which year it was, but back in 100 years or more ago, in the US government decided that they were going to implement a census process in the US. And they came up with a requirement that meant that there was no then current technology that would actually be able to calculate and actually conduct the census within the time frame that it was supposed to take place, which was something like 10 years. It was just not possible to actually complete all the calculations in time. So somebody invented a calculating machine. I think it was Mr. Hollerith created the Hollerith tabulating machine. The Hollerith tabulating machine was later acquired by a number of other companies and became a company called IBM. Technology can be a major driver. That one took a while. I think in FX currently we've actually got the opposite problem, that back in 2009 we thought that regulation would dramatically impact our market and cause change to occur within that year, and that probably have central clearing in place by the end of 2009 to cover all instruments. It hasn't happened. We're still all of us sitting on the edges of our chairs waiting for the new CEF regulations to come out. And many of us have made bets along the way about what that's going to look like and what kind of companies we have to be. But I do feel that for the last couple of years, it's actually been a stifler of innovation rather than actually spurring innovation. But maybe over the next year, if we do finally get the CEF regulations out, we'll see that change occurring.
During the Lehman crisis, Eurodollar only moved 3.5 pips over the weekend that Lehman was failing. Prime brokerage system worked, CLS system worked, possibly all votes of confidence for the OTC FX market. So we're out of time. Thank you very much to the panelists. Please join me in thanking them.